I'm excited for this discussion, and I want to get into some of the areas that I know you're super interested in, Martin, in terms of the future of health and fertility. But I think in order to really set the stage for where we are today and where we're going, we need to really understand where women's health is today. And this predates even the technology that all of your companies use. It wasn't, correct me if I'm wrong, but it wasn't that long ago that the state of the art for testing a new drug was to see if it worked on a white guy. And if it worked on a white guy, then it clearly must work on women, right? How long ago was that?
2018?
Yeah. So part of the challenge is many of the products and devices and stuff that you guys need, men might find difficult to even test and use. How long has it been, and I hope the answer is not 2018, how long has it been that there have been people willing to invest in women's health technology, period?
There's always been a few very progressive and kind of visionary investors, but I still think there's a lot of space for people to invest into female health. The opportunities are massive. I think the amount of money is still not being reflected in that opportunity. So how long has it been easy? I don't know.
I didn't say easy. Just available and
available.
possible.
I think there's still lots of room for investors to get to the game.
So tell a little bit maybe about your app and when you guys got funded and so forth.
Yeah, so our funding story started with 5 angels that each put in 10,000 euros. So very humble. We were basically out of money from the beginning. And then we eventually got institutional investors on board and have now raised 30 million euros through 2 rounds, mostly from male investors. One of the reasons is that there are, of course, not so many female partners in venture funds. But I do think that the landscape has changed. When we first started, it was very much considered a niche product, and I don't think anybody will say that women's health is a niche anymore. I mean, it's kind of laughable at this point to even have to mention it. But having said that, I do think that when you sit in front of a male investor, it does take a little bit of extra explaining for them to go like, yes, and then this emotional yes is maybe sometimes harder to get to.
Do you think as many challenges as there were, do you think there would have been more if fertility wasn't tied to both parts of a heterosexual couple? That, if you were targeting a part of women's health that really affected only women, and it's a chance to bring in other things. I mean, you're looking specifically at women's health stuff. Is it even harder to get attention and funding and focus?
So we launched LV, which is a connected product. So there's the hardware and the software. So yeah, it's hard because particularly if you say consumer electronics and you say women, it's never been an innovative space. There's always been consumer electronics for the female consumer, but maybe you're thinking about turning something pink or turning your Fitbit into a bracelet. So I do think as a women's health tech company, we had to kind of hit a few more milestones, which maybe we wouldn't have had
Explain
to
your product too, because I'll have you as well. I'll have actually each of you explain your products, because I think it's helpful as we're having this discussion.
So we're LV, so it's all about smarter technology for women, and we're launching multiple connected devices, so hardware and software, that improve women's lives. The first product is LV Trainer. So it's actually a small pod that you insert into your body, like a tampon, and it connects to your phone, and it helps women do their pelvic floor exercise. So it's a really important part of women's health for all women at some stage in their lives, but it's a very neglected issue. So for us, we had the stigma of it being for women and hardware, and also kind of to do with medical issues that people don't like to talk about. But as I said, we kind of managed to hit a lot of milestones. So within 6 months, we already hit a profit, and we're already on prescription on the National Health Service, and also managed to change the conversation. Because fundamentally, when you're bringing in a new category of product, you have to change the way that people think about their bodies, about behavior, about the technology. And we're launching a second product also for women's health in about 4 months.
And Priya, you guys are using data, but also addressing women's health issues. Tell a little bit about what you guys are doing.
Absolutely. So Cellmatics is a next-generation women's health company. I founded the company in 2009. And what we mean by next-generation women's health is that we leverage big data, including genomics, to help women make more informed decisions about their bodies and their health. So this year, 2017, we were really proud to launch the first genetic test that enables women to understand whether they are born with hard-coded risk factors for the most common reproductive conditions, including early menopause. And one of the things that I hear a lot from investors, always male, when I get this commentary is, would women really want to know that they were at risk for these things? And so we had this aha moment that if we just make it a male analogy, it becomes a no-brainer. So if we say to a male investor, well, imagine if all men underwent testicular failure at age 50, impacting your sex life, your health, your longevity, et cetera, your fertility. And
You'd have artificial testicles by now.
right? Well, yes, a lot more. And imagine if some men went into testicular failure at 40, and some of them at 30, and some of them in college. And they were diagnosed with mental health issues and went undiagnosed for 5 to 10 years because no one thought to suspect that their testicles had failed prematurely. So welcome to the world of women. And what if now there was a test and information that could help you know whether you were at risk, and importantly, there were then actions you could take, like freezing your eggs, right? Like changing things that may accelerate that. So when I say it that way, it just kind of goes away. But in 2009, when we were raising money, it was impossible. We did not raise money for almost 2 years, so it was bootstrapped for many years. I do think it's getting better, but what's been really interesting is that it went from people saying, this is so niche, to now sometimes we hear, the space is so crowded, right? Which is just, yeah.
And that's a kind of a good segue to you, because it's similarly, like it's either an ignored market or how do you stand out from a dozen competitors? So talk about your product and kind of where you guys are today.
So what people will see when they go to the App Store is an app that helps them understand their cycle. When is my next period coming? When can I become pregnant? When can I maybe experience bad moods? But when I think about Clue, I really think about us being a data platform. Like, how can we connect many types of different data so that we can have a much deeper conversation with the users? For instance, maybe we can help them find cell metrics so that they can understand if they are at risk for early menopause. Like, I think there is a space in the world for women to kind of go somewhere where they can navigate their whole reproductive health life. That's one part of it, and the other part is this space where you can feel at home, because I think a huge part of the female experience is that the world kind of tries to ignore that we have this biology, and it becomes like you are kind of living next to yourself. And I think what we can help people feel is that it's okay, it's even great that we have this biology. It creates humans on the planet, for instance, and many other wonderful things. So really create a place where people can come and find information and understand their own body.
And Martin, you come at this from a slightly different perspective. Talk about your work.
I wanted to say that I guess the path in this panel for a woman would be to first go to Clue, to then see how regular or irregular she may be and what's going on. Then if she starts wondering, she would then go to Cellmatics and try to understand more what's going on with her genetics. And then maybe you would send some of these women to us at Prelude to freeze their eggs and to maybe make embryos if they're in a relationship and genetically test these embryos. And then they would give birth, and then they would go to you after birth, so everything goes back into shape, right? And so there is an order to this panel.
So now you guys can have a bundled offering.
Yes,
Business
we should do
DLD.
a month subscription.
Yeah.
And then regarding raising money, we raised $200 million to start Prelude, but I would say that was on the back, not of a woman's product, but more of my track record as an entrepreneur. And now that I've been newly involved after building companies that make Wi-Fi routers, fiber optics, solar farms, and these products that tend to be associated with somebody connecting a Wi-Fi router, which tends to be a guy. there is a lot of prejudice. I just can say that there is a lot of prejudice. I wanted Prelude to be a woman run and managed company, which it is now because I became chairman and Susan Hertzberg became CEO, but I had to fight prejudice in creating a woman-led company. There is a lot of investors who didn't think it was a good idea. I said all the top managers should be women because we're selling a product mainly to women. This should be a woman-to-woman's conversation. And I have tremendous empathy now at the level of prejudice there is in fundraising for women's product and for women's entrepreneurs. I'm saying this is improving, but I don't think it's solved at all.
Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, I came here from CES, and I think I saw you guys there, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe? No? One of your competitors. But, you know, on the, you know...
The inferior one.
Totally different. Not nearly as good. But, you know, the keynotes, there was a big issue. All the keynote speakers were men.
Yeah.
And it was like, you know, well, we need to have the important, you know, conversations. And it strikes me that much of the industry still doesn't, to your point, doesn't think of consumer electronics not, you know, as even a conversation that needs to involve women. What has been the response, and obviously all your products are different, but what has been the response of women to the idea that there are actually products on the market that aren't just men's products painted pink, but even address needs that are unrelated to men or not directly related to men?
So maybe I'll start by saying my end goal is not to have a world ruled by women. My end goal is to have a balanced world. I really think that men and women need to work together to have a great world. So I think what we're starting to see is that men start being like, oh, there's a part of the world over here that I don't see every day, that I'm not aware of. And this kind of little openness of, oh, there is kind of this blind spot, or there's this part of life that I don't have access to. I feel that opening's happening, and I think we as founders should do everything we can to try and loop in men and include them and try and tell what is that story that you're just starting to learn about. So for me, it's all about how do we include men into this world. It's not about how do we kind of create our own bubble of this. We need to work together in this. I don't think female health will truly advance till everybody takes it seriously, basically.
But I also think it's about women rooting for women in certain cases. Like if you think of Hillary versus Trump, you wish women had rooted a little more for women, right? And what happens in the end is that when you have a product that's geared to women, like our product is a difficult product for women because they come into the world thinking, I'm just going to have as many babies as I want to have. And then it turns out that about a third of women never meet their maternity goals, around a fifth of women never have any babies. And that's because in the education, there's a conjunction of poor education, there's just poor education of women's issues, combined with a slight sense of denial, right? So this combination, so what we're doing in this panel could be summarized as awareness. Yeah. Awareness of the issues that affect women's life, and which includes everyone, but it also includes women wanting to be aware of their biology.
So we want to accomplish a couple things in this panel. In addition to talking about this, we're going to talk about some advanced issues in fertility. I had another question, but I think you were going to say something.
Well, I just got back from the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference, and there were more CEOs named Michael presenting at JP Morgan than all the women combined. So that's one. And the second is that we've been doing surveys of thousands of women across the United States. And it's really interesting to see that I think where a lot of this comes from is there's still a lot of stigma attached to even talking about this stuff, right? So I noticed you didn't say vagina. You said insert it into your body. And I'm
vagina.
Guessing, yeah. I'm guessing that...
Like a tampon.
Right. When I heard you say that, I thought it's so subtle, but it's stitched into everything. We learned that 60% of women don't talk to anybody about their fertility concerns. And what was really shocking to us is that half of all women who go through a miscarriage don't tell their friends about it, and 1 in 5 don't even tell their partner. So that was really staggering to us. So for us, we started a campaign last week called Say the F Word. And it's about, in 2018, getting people to pledge to say the F word with us, to destigmatize talking about any aspect of a woman's body, her vagina, her reproductive health, her fertility. I think it's really important because until we destigmatize it, it does feel niche in a sense because it feels like, oh, I'm not an investor who does that, right? But the reality is that there are more women on planet Earth than cancer patients, people with diabetes, people with mental health conditions. And so we have to make this no longer niche in a real way.
And not only empower women to be aware and speak more, but also men. Men have the opposite problem of omnipotence. Like in the case of fertility, in the 20s, half of the cases of infertility is related to men, right? Nobody speaks about that. Everybody thinks infertility is a woman's problem, more of a woman's problem. And then in the 40s and 50s, the problems of men is that they tend to, just by themselves, contribute to twice the amount of severe mental illness in their children, right? But men have this sense of omnipotence that everything is great with me, and women, unfortunately, have this sense if there's a problem, it's my problem. Both are out of balance, sort of to moderate the thoughts of men and to bring up the empowerment of women to achieve balance. It's like, obviously, I don't want this to go. I just share with you what you said, to achieve a balanced conversation about fertility.
Well, and we're bringing up fertility, and this is probably the most male of women's health issues. I mean, fertility is an issue that does affect a couple, sometimes a woman and a man if it's a heterosexual couple. I'm wondering how neglected, are the rest of women's health issues. I mean, you get it at some of the women's health, but there's a variety of women's health issues. What's one issue that's kind of front of mind, maybe that your company isn't dealing with, but you were like, man, I wish more people were investing in a solution to X that's not fertility?
Every issue to do with womanhood is underinvested in. So that's why I can't believe people say it's a crowded space. I mean, if they say fertility is a crowded space, maybe because there's some tracking apps. There's not many looking at egg freezing and all the different aspects around their fertility. But we live in, as Ida was saying, it's such a PC world, we forget that men and women are fundamentally different. And nearly every woman goes through periods, menopause, pregnancy, birth. And each of those areas is an important part of a woman's life, which technology can make easier, and it's been underexploited.
I think a few areas. So endometriosis is a condition, causes extreme pain, can predispose you for certain cancers.
Which
for
one did you say, sorry?
Endometriosis.
Endometriosis, yeah.
It impacts at least 10% of all women, though it's an underdiagnosed condition. The US government spent $10 million researching endometriosis last year. The same year that they spent $50 million researching anthrax, which impacted 0 American lives, right? So
I want to ask the crowd, how many people know what endometriosis is?
Or PCOS.
So
about quarter.
Yeah.
Quarter of the crowd. Yeah, so endometriosis, preeclampsia, is one of the most expensive things that can happen to a payer. A woman ends up admitted multiple times in the hospital. It's a pregnancy complication. She can die from it. Her baby can die from it. Vastly under-researched. One of the things that's remarkable to us at Cellmatics is that we're now in the post-genomic era of humanity. Actually, we're in the second decade of the post-genomic era. In the pre-genomic era, we treated things like cancer with the biggest hammer we could find. So we targeted cell growth. Now, in the post-genomic era, we have over 1,000 targeted cancer treatments that really get to the heart of the disease. In the pre-genomic era, we treated women's health conditions by either delaying menopause a little bit by adding estrogen, or not delaying menopause, but delaying the feeling of menopause, or inducing menopause, right, by taking away estrogen. So our biggest hammer. In the post-genomic era, 2 decades into the post-genomic era, all women's health conditions basically are treated exactly the same way. The treatment for preeclampsia is delivering the baby, right? That's how sophisticated we are in the post-genomic era in treating women's health conditions. Contraceptive drugs, again, target the reproductive system with the biggest hammer. In the post-genomic era, we can develop targeted drugs, better contraceptive pills, everything, but it requires, beyond just venture capital, government funding, it requires people to see this as a priority. And we're talking about women's health, but one of the things that we like to point out is that every human on planet Earth was a woman for around 9 months, minimally, right? So every one of you in this room was a woman at some point in your life. So when we talk about women's health, we're talking about human health.
And there's also social issues that are not very well addressed. For example, men in their 40s have 300% more the amount of babies as women in their 40s. And divorce hits half of the couples, right? So half of the couples get divorced and men go on having children. These issues can be addressed with fertility preservation or embryo. Well, not in the case of divorce, sorry, but in the case of couples who want to have babies later in life. And these issues are seldom addressed because people fall into the illusion that, well, they'll be married forever, but then men have many more choices than women in their 40s. And technology can fix that. Technology can enable men and women to have the same chances, but the communication around that is seen as a negative for women. It's like saying, what are you preparing for divorce? Well, why should you not prepare for something that hits half of the population?
Maybe did you want to say something before we shift topics a little?
I'm sitting thinking fundamentally it's about creating space in the world for women to live on women's terms, including what our biology is. And women have always used whatever tools we had, and many of them were very inadequate. They still are. But I do think that technology can be part of creating a world where women can live more in tune with the body that they have. They will still use tools like egg freezing to maybe, form their lives as they want. But fundamentally, I feel that life should kind of warp around, it shouldn't be us warping around work. It should be kind of us being the center, and then everything else can warp around,
Well, that's a perfect segue to the broader conversation I was hoping to have. Martin, maybe one way to start this off. So I want to talk about some of the reproductive technologies that are either here or on the horizon, and then have a really good discussion on what some of the deep questions that raises, because I think this would be of interest to a lot of people in the room. So Martin, we've all heard terms like egg freezing. We've all heard, this idea. What are some of the technologies that people might not be aware of that are either here today or looming on the horizon? And then I want to get into the ethical and
there's already very different legislation in reproductive technology. For example, Germany is a very restrictive country in terms of legislation. In Germany, if a man has issues with his sperm, in that couple, they can get a sperm donor. But if a woman, if she has issues with her eggs, it's illegal to get an egg donor, right? So that is legal in most countries, but it's illegal in Germany. And it's something that I think should be very much of a woman's right to get help in those circumstances. In terms of genetic screening is allowed in Germany once a woman is pregnant, so she can abort if something is going wrong with a future child, but it's not allowed on embryos, which is pretty hard to understand. In almost every other country, it's allowed on embryos, because then you were never pregnant with a fetus you were going to abort, right? But here that's not allowed. There's issues. Soon we'll be able to genetically modify embryos. And the question is, should we genetically modify embryos? My personal stance is we should, to avoid illness. We shouldn't to make super great looking babies, right? Where I'm not into designer babies, but Prelude is into helping people have healthy babies, either
and
by
where do you
choosing.
define the line?
Well, I think medicine has cataloged illnesses, and these illnesses, for example, avoiding cystic fibrosis. Well, that's a very well-defined monogenic illness. You do a test, and if two parents are positive for cystic fibrosis, they will have 1 chance in 4 of having a baby with cystic fibrosis. They have 3 other embryos they can choose for, and that would be, I think, a reasonable choice to make. So it's about illnesses that are accepted as illnesses. But I agree with you that there may be a fine line. For example, gender selection. Gender selection is allowed in the United States. It's not allowed in most of Europe. It's not allowed in Germany. And it's something that personally, I believe maybe gender selection should not be allowed if it yields to an imbalance. But if society is neutral and somebody has 2 boys, they want a girl, they have 2 girls, they want a boy, I'm totally fine with it. But gender selection is already a reality and has been a reality in the United States for a long time, and is not allowed in Europe. And we know that there's some Asian populations that have a strong preference for boys, and they abort girls or they select embryos that will be boys, right? And that's something certainly quite controversial. And then there's CRISPR, which is a technology that allows for gene editing, and there's the beginning of CRISPR. The first use of CRISPR in human embryos was very recent, and there's people who have very mixed feelings about that. I personally have concerns on the safety of CRISPR, but if somebody showed me that you can edit embryos for some illnesses that people would not have because if CRISPR was used, I certainly would be in favor, but I can see why there would be disagreements. Then there's, of course, the religious element in all this, and there's, for example, Judaism and Islam do not believe that embryos are people, but many Christians believe that embryos are people, and therefore the whole debate on abortion and all that. I personally believe it's much worse to do an abortion in the 4th month because you found out in the 4th month what you could have found out with an embryo you never used. But for some people, a 4th month and an embryo is the same thing, and that's an open debate.
Okay, well, we've got more that I want to get to into the future, but I just want to get thoughts from others on just we've already raised a bunch of issues from, should we edit genes? Should we allow people to see? And I don't so much want to get into a debate on any of those particular ones, but I am curious what each of your reactions is. What are the questions, in hearing Martin talk, what are the questions that raises for you? What are the things that we as a society should be thinking about based on the capabilities, just the ones Martin's talked about so far?
Well, I think particularly a lot of us are tech entrepreneurs, and we're kind of used to the mantra, we need to race ahead of the regulation, and regulation will catch up. But as Martin was saying, so many of these technologies are already available. The amount of genetic editing that can happen pre-implementation is much higher than what is currently regulated for. And I think it's one of those areas where I am more on the cautious side with Martin as well, that we need to define the boundaries quite clearly. But then as Martin also says, genetic selection happens, be it through how we choose our partners. Actually, I worked at Mary Stopes before, which is the largest private provider of women's health services, including access to safe abortion. And in China and Vietnam, as we know, there's a huge amount of gender selection happening through abortions, which is a lot more damaging. So it is all along that continuum, isn't it? And at what point do you count there being a human soul, I suppose?
I think the UK is getting it right on this. They have the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority, the HFEA, and it's a regulatory advisory group that brings in religious leaders, ethicists, members of the general public, embryologists, doctors, scientists. I think every country needs an HFEA because every country is going to have a slightly different take on this based on culturally what's their norm. And I think when you have something like an HFEA, you can say, wait a minute, why are we allowing sperm donation, but we're not allowing egg donation? What are the fundamentals that we're working with here? And you also get all the stakeholders at the table. So I just would love to see us acknowledging, at the same time that we're destigmatizing talking about this stuff, I think we also have to convene these organizations across different parts of the planet where they can have those very open discussions.
I don't know. I don't think I'm not an expert in this field. I can have my own kind of ethical stance on it. My kind of higher priority question in my mind is like, how do we create women's lives where they maybe don't feel that they have to have a specific gender, where they don't feel that they cannot postpone having children So
I mean, that I think is one of the questions that the technology raises is, and companies, this has been an issue in Silicon Valley where you have tech companies paying for egg freezing, which sounds like a benefit, but then you have a lot of women saying, wait a second, The message is we want you to delay having a pregnancy, not how can we build a company that will support you as an employee and a parent. And I think that is really one of the conversations. It's great to have technologies that are available if someone's actually choosing that versus having that technology thrust upon them.
That's a very good point. At Prelude, we have clinics in 12 cities in the United States, and one of them is San Francisco, where we have Pacific Fertility, and that is the area of the United States with the highest number of egg freezing cycles, right? And people in Europe have reacted to what we do in the States and have said, this imprisons women at work. What the desire of these companies is to imprison women at work. And my answer is, the desire of these companies is to recruit, attract, retain, and give choices to women. If you have a nursery, if you have a place where you can leave your baby, if you're friendly to those who have babies, if you're a baby child-friendly company and you offer egg freezing, and you have family benefits, and you offer maternal leave, and you offer parental leave in general, then I think those take away the argument of the idea of enslaving women in the workplace. Now, if there was a company who only offered egg freezing and was not family friendly, I would tend to side with the people who say, well, that's all they want is women to delay maternity. But that is not the case at all. We know these companies have all sorts of benefits, and this is one of them.
But I think to Edith's point, even if that's not their explicit goal, I think you take a step back as a society. Are we putting enough pressure on our employers to create a world where we have those choices, including the choice to delay pregnancy and freeze eggs, if that's the choice they want? Or is there still way too much pressure? It's interesting that we have solutions for egg freezing, and we're still struggling with some of the other aspects of fertility. And I wonder, why are we so far ahead in that? What's the impetus?
So we've seen an interesting thing. So we have the Fertilome genetic test now implemented, and we've seen in women in our company that some women, based on the fact that they don't have genetic risk factors, choose not to freeze their eggs for now. And we see women who tested positive for many risk factors who then feel really good about freezing their eggs. And when you have the information about whether you personally are at risk, then egg freezing being offered by your employer is extremely empowering, because what they're saying is, if you need it, then we've got your back, right? I think what created some of the controversy is that it felt like all women should go put their eggs in the freezer and come back to work. And I think the message should have been, if you know you're at risk, right, we've got your back. Importantly, when I first started the company almost 9 years ago, the statistic that we would cite is that for the first time in US history, more babies were born to mothers in their 30s than teenage mothers. And that was a big deal, right? Now, 8 years into this, the statistic we're citing is that more babies are born to mothers in their 30s than in their 20s, right? So it's very quickly, the average age of first birth is going up rapidly across the board, Europe, US, Asia.
And is that a universally positive thing? Is there an upper limit? Like what? Well,
we know that on average, women across the world go into ovarian failure, also known as menopause, at 51, right? And so we know there's an upper limit. Technology helps us. I think what Martine's doing is helping us push the boundaries on that. But one of the things I get asked a lot is there a fertility crisis? And I think the word crisis is inflammatory, so I don't like to use it, but I think in this case there is a coming fertility crisis in the sense that we're not investing enough in understanding it. We're not empowering it. Very few states in the US where most people rely on insurance coverage to get the health care that they need, very few states mandate any coverage for fertility care. And even in the mandated states, not all states cover IVF, for example, or egg freezing. So I think the the intersection of where the demographic trends are going, irrespective of an employer saying, go freeze your eggs and come back to work, they're headed in that direction. I do think that if we had a more female-friendly workplace, if Ida's vision came true, where the world wrapped itself around the biology of women and the fact that we have, through our birth, inherited this unique position of being the ones who give babies to the planet, if we could orient around the needs of women, I do think maybe we could reverse some of that trend, because I think a lot of women are waiting till later because they have to feel financially secure, because they have to get secure enough in their careers, if they're on that track, to feel like they can take a step back for a minute to have a baby. I think we can start to reverse it, but I think we have to make the decisions now, because the trajectory we are on is not a good one.
I think also there's an issue, which is people do not know what's going to happen to their lives. Like I have 7 children, and the last one was born a year ago, and my wife is there, Nina, and we have froze eggs, froze sperm, had a child. And you just don't know. You have a child, you say, maybe I won't have any more children. Maybe I'll have another child. What we do is we bridge people's psychology with people's biology. Like, why have a biological clock that's running your life? You may never use those eggs. You may never have more children, but you had the choice. This is the first generation, because Piraye was citing a number of firsts in the generation. It's also the first generation of women that's going to spend way more time in menopause than in fertility, right? Menopause is, because you said 51, but frankly, from our stats at 40, the women who show up at our clinics at 40, we maybe are successful a third of the time, okay? I don't know if you would agree, but it sounds like...
menopause, that's the cessation of menses, but infertility starts over a decade before.
Way early, right? And so it's a question of giving people more choices. If somebody had told me in my 20s that I was going to have 7 children, I would have said, you're crazy, you're not. And I'm probably maybe the only person who doesn't believe in God that has 7 children. But I don't know, it just happened. You know, life is what happens to you. And that's why we want people to have more choices.
If there's time and if there's microphones, I'd love to open it up to the audience. Before we do that, are there microphones, by the way? Yeah, okay. Before we do that, I wanted to quickly get the thoughts. Which of the following do you think will be possible within the next 10 years? Do you think there will be 2 women to create a biological child, 2 men's DNA to create a biological child, and will it be possible for someone who was not born female to carry a child?
So I get asked this a lot. I actually did my PhD in egg biology, reproductive health. So I love that idea. It's not going to happen in the next 10 years. So it's not. So what we know from studying other mammalian systems is that you can get part of the way through reproduction, through parthenogenetic activation, so it's virgin birth. So you can get part of the way without a sperm, for example. And they have really, I mean, people are thinking about this a lot. It turns out that for reasons that we still don't understand, there are epigenetic signals, meaning chemical signals that are placed on the DNA that actually have a no-go stoppage, right? Where you can't actually progress past a certain stage of development. It figures out at some point that a male was not involved, right? So I think we just don't, because we're not investing in the science, I think we don't understand yet how to move around those breaks that biology puts on wanting to make sure that a male and a female were involved in the creation of an organism. But I think it's certainly, with biology, it's one of those things where if you can imagine it, you can do it, but it requires investment to understand it.
I think that the issue of 2 men having a baby is something that's already been solved in the United States with surrogacy, which is not allowed in many places in Europe, not allowed in Germany. the question of two men using their own genetic material, to make a baby, and two women using their own genetic material to make a baby, there's two issues, the embryo making and the gestation, right? There's been experiments and there's people that have been working on artificial gestational carriers, and I think that if you give enough time, it will happen. The issue of making out of any cell, not out of an egg or sperm, a baby, there's already a significant amount of work heading in that direction. So in the short run, I agree with Pirai. In the short run, if you tell me in 3 years, no way. But if you said 10 years, 15 years, if you give enough time, I think many different cells could be used to make babies. Gender will be irrelevant, and pregnancy will be optional.
All right. Well, I think on that note, we'll open it up to questions. I see a hand over there in the corner.
Hi.
If you introduce yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Mira Veda. I have a company called Lipstick and Politics. I have a 16-month-old, and I was just listening to you talk about preeclampsia, and I had preeclampsia, and you're right. The only way to resolve the issue was to, he was born 2 months early. He's totally fine. He's great. A little bit of a brat these days, but he's great. I'm curious, and I read an article on this, and maybe you guys can elaborate that cancer patients were having their ovaries taken out and frozen and then put back in, and there was some success around that. So I'm curious about that. Like, will instead of freezing embryos, will we be freezing your follicle tubes or whatever? Will we be, and is there a possibility of also taking out the uterus and then putting it back in? And is there another way potentially, I know these are 3 questions, and is there another way to incubate a baby? Because as much as I loved being pregnant, I would love to know if there's another way to do that.
And the flip side, I'd always hoped I would carry our last child. At this point, we're not going to have more kids, so I won't get that opportunity. But I know there's a lot of transgender women, not to mention other women who can't carry children that would like to.
Yeah. Well, so let's go through those.
Yeah, there's a bunch.
Just maybe quickly, I do think the future is going to go beyond egg freezing to freezing slices of the ovarian cortex. So the ovary is mostly not that interesting. There's a tiny layer on the outside called the ovarian cortex where the egg precursors live. And the best technology would enable us to take a piece of that cortex, put it in the freezer, and then when you're ready, you could put it back in your body and make the eggs from that yourself, or you could do it in a dish, or somebody else could make them for you. So working with that ovarian cortex would be great. One of the world's leaders in pushing that research forward had to retire early because he couldn't get funding. So again, possible, it's the future. Another thing that similar research groups were working on was for women, especially girls who are undergoing chemotherapy or something, or radiation therapy, you can actually remove the ovary during the procedure, keep it somewhere safe, kind of. And one of the places they were putting it for women undergoing radiation was to actually implant it in your skin of your arm, for example. And what was interesting is you can kind of see it grow and get smaller during the course of the menstrual cycle. So you can actually put it somewhere else in your body and keep it safe and put it back later. So these things are moving forward, again, underfunded. Uterine transplants have just started as well. So I think those things where we're not fundamentally rewriting the code, which I think getting 2 men and 2 women to reproduce genetically, that's much harder than the kinds of things that you're talking about.
And if I were a little younger, could I carry a kid?
Well, that question
I think that's more doable. Are we investing in the research to enable that? That I don't know. I think the answer is no.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah,
Just
please.
kind of a perspective on the conversation. It's fascinating to hear about these things. I think there's still a big question like, do we want these things and when and so on? But I just want to kind of put perspective on the whole conversation. There's a huge field of every kind of normal person with a uterus going through these amazing cycles every month where a lot of changes are happening in the body, our brain changes, our vision sense, our sense of smell, our sexuality. Like just having every normal person know what that system is about and live well with that, that's a huge task on the planet, and removing social taboos around that. So even before we get to these really, really extreme advanced areas of female health, there's like the 99% of the work to be done in just having this be a good, normal part of our lives. And just want to remember that as we talk about
I'd
this.
only challenge you on your terminology. I agree there are a lot of people with menstrual cycles that if we helped understand better, would be happier. Some of those people with menstrual cycles identify as men. Some women don't have menstrual cycles.
Yeah.
Sorry, you were going to say something.
No, I was going to answer the other question, which is you said you didn't feel like that you love your child, but maybe you didn't want to be pregnant again soon. That you sort of, you wanted just the benefits, right? and I think the only solution that there is now, and it's mostly available in the United States, which is the same solution for gay couples to have children, is surrogacy.
I will just also add that I think it's not just a burden to be pregnant. I think it's also an amazing journey and experience for many women, and an opportunity to really kind of feel your body and live this biology that we have. So it's not just this is a very good example where we have a social norm saying, if we could just
I'm not an advocate of surrogacy as an elective procedure. I just believe we should empower people to have choices. My wife carried her baby, and she was very happy, or at least said so during the pregnancy. And I believe that surrogacy, if anything, should be left to help either gay couples or women who actually cannot carry their babies, which there are quite a significant number.
So unfortunately, I think we're out of time, but I want to, first of all, thank DLD for making the space for us to have this conversation. It's important. All the people in the audience, not all of whom have uteruses and ovaries, that came to attend, as well as those that do. If you enjoyed this conversation, let folks know, and hopefully we'll have more of them. If you enjoy my style, I have a daily newsletter. Getlogin.axios.com will get you my daily newsletter. And thank you to the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.